At 2:28 a.m., a vital connection from inside Nancy Guthrie's body to the outside world abruptly ceased. The monitoring signal from her pacemaker simply vanished. Investigators, however, now suspect that a critical event had already taken place before that signal was lost. As a forensic expert analyzing the evidence proposed an unsettling new theory. What if the entire kidnapping story was a fabrication? What if the clues actually suggest a pattern that investigators occasionally encounter in cases with elderly victims, specifically elder abuse? Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, and she resided by herself in the Catalina foothills of Tucson. Her ability to move was restricted, and she was dependent on daily medication. Anyone who came to her house that evening would have been fully aware of just how defenseless she really was. Tonight, we will delve into the forensic reasoning that supports this theory of elder abuse and explore the evidence that authorities are now re-examining. If this hypothesis holds true, the most chilling question may not be about who abducted Nancy Guthrie at all. Instead, it might be about who was aware of her vulnerability and saw her as a prime target. Make sure to subscribe and follow along, because the information investigators found from the hours preceding her disappearance presents questions that remain unanswered to this day. Nancy Guthrie's last known hours started as a completely ordinary, peaceful Saturday evening. She departed from her residence in Tucson's Catalina foothills at 5:32 p.m. to take an Uber to her daughter Annie's home for a dinner engagement, a trip that was later verified by the driver. The journey was uneventful, followed by a family dinner filled with conversation, a perfectly typical evening. Around 9:45 p.m., Nancy was driven back to her house by Annie's husband, and from that point forward, the night transforms into a mystery pieced together almost exclusively by digital clues. There were no witnesses and no confirmed sightings of her, just electronic devices that captured pieces of the events that followed. 4 hours later, the initial unusual incident is recorded. Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera is taken offline. Authorities would later determine that the unit had been physically taken from the home, and the person who approached the residence that night clearly knew its precise location. Yet, taking the camera down introduced a new complication, as a different sensor on the property continued to register motion. Just 16 minutes after that, an even more critical event unfolds. Then, at 2:28 a.m., the monitoring feed from Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker goes offline, severing its connection to her phone. While the phone itself is still inside the home, Nancy is now too far away for the device to maintain its signal. Authorities have come to believe this specific moment could mark the precise time that Nancy Guthrie was removed from her residence. This case is built on 3 timestamps: a camera being removed, motion being sensed, and a pacemaker signal vanishing, all in a quiet community where practically nobody saw or heard a thing. Yet, for the forensic professionals examining the case, these specific times bring up a query that detectives simply cannot overlook. In the weeks following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the investigation centered on a probable kidnapping scenario. This theory was fueled by a short glimpse of a masked individual captured on the restored footage from her porch camera. Her video doorbell was physically removed from its mounting, and traces of blood were subsequently discovered near her front door. All of these details appeared to confirm a violent abduction had occurred. But as forensic experts started to scrutinize the timeline with greater care, certain aspects of the case began to seem out of place. The sequence of events didn't perfectly align with the majority of kidnapping cases. In most abduction scenarios, detectives typically discover evidence of a forced entry, a struggle within the residence, or clues indicating the victim was removed in a hurry. Nancy Guthrie's house presented a much different scene because her phone and her wallet were both left behind. It didn't seem like anything had been taken, and there were no indications of a frantic break-in. That particular detail started to create doubt for the analysts who were studying the evidence, since criminals who force their way into a home are usually after something valuable. In this situation, however, the house seemed to be almost entirely untouched. This is the reason some forensic specialists began exploring an alternative explanation, one that sometimes arises in cases that involve elderly victims. The theory was elder abuse, but not in the way many people might picture it. Instead, this involves situations where a defenseless person is targeted for their assets or for what another individual thinks they could potentially acquire. Investigations into elder abuse frequently lead to people who are already familiar with the victim's daily schedule. They are aware of when the individual is likely to be by themselves. These individuals know when the neighbors are probably sleeping and are aware that the victim might not be capable of fighting back. Nancy Guthrie was 84. Her mobility was limited, and she depended on medication and medical equipment. Anyone observing her daily life would have soon noticed something that investigators are now taking very seriously. Nancy Guthrie was exceptionally defenseless. That acknowledgement fundamentally alters how investigators may handle a case, because if an individual was already familiar with her lifestyle, the crime might not have needed a break-in at all. It may have only depended on one key piece of information, knowing the perfect time to arrive. When forensic experts investigate crimes that involve older victims, they usually start by asking a very straightforward question. Who had enough knowledge of the victim's life to be aware of their daily patterns? This doesn't imply that investigators jump to suspecting relatives. But past cases have shown that crimes against vulnerable people often include individuals who were acquainted with them in some capacity, such as caregivers, neighbors, people providing services, or others who had been to the house before. The logic behind why investigators consider these angles is related to what's known as a pattern of access. A person who is already acquainted with the residence might know the locations of any cameras. They could know which lights are typically on at night, and they might have a sense of how long it would take for neighbors to spot something strange. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, a single detail from the retrieved camera footage remains particularly significant. The individual in the mask didn't seem to be looking for the camera. That person moved straight towards it, obscured the lens, and then took the device down. This degree of assurance points to something that investigators always weigh heavily: prior knowledge. This is because a person arriving at a house for the very first time will often show hesitation. They will scan the area, peer into windows, and attempt to get a feel for the property's layout, but the figure on the porch moved with clear intent. That specific detail has prompted another critical question, and if the perpetrator already knew the property well enough to disable the security camera so efficiently, how did they get that information in the first place? While authorities haven't released an answer to that question, forensic specialists note that figuring out how a suspect learns about a victim is often the crucial element in solving crimes against vulnerable people. Planning an offense like this rarely starts on the night it takes place. It frequently begins much earlier, through surveillance, by learning a person's schedule, and occasionally by spotting a vulnerability that no one else has seen. This all points to the possibility that investigators are still working to figure out if someone went after Nancy Guthrie because they saw her as an easy target. How long were they observing her before she was taken? When law enforcement analyzes cases involving senior citizens, a single motive appears time and again: money. It isn't always about vast fortunes, as it can be related to an inheritance, real estate, or a financial strain that was invisible to everyone on the outside. With the Guthrie case, the family's financial situation has presented inquiries that law enforcement must seriously consider. Nancy resided in a house worth over $1 million, located in a highly exclusive Tucson community. Her daughter is Savannah Guthrie, a well-known national television personality. According to public information, her personal wealth is estimated to be in the tens of millions of dollars. This type of sharp financial disparity can occasionally be a significant factor during a criminal probe, as detectives frequently pose a very precise question in these circumstances. Who stands to gain from the abrupt disappearance of an elderly individual? Posing that question isn't an accusation against anyone, but it does allow detectives to formulate a roster of potential scenarios, including inheritance, insurance payouts, monetary transfers, and property rights. Detectives systematically review every one of these elements whenever an older person vanishes under questionable conditions. And in the Guthrie investigation, financial statements and legal papers have reportedly been incorporated into this review. Financial forensic specialists will sometimes search for any strange modifications that happened prior to a crime being committed. These can include transfers of power, alterations to legal papers, new authorizations for accounts, or changes in who has financial oversight. In a large number of elder abuse situations, Such adjustments can be seen for months before anything appears to go wrong, and the logic behind this is uncomplicated. Financial offenses that target the elderly are very rarely spur-of-the-moment acts. They are almost always premeditated, which is the reason authorities will often scrutinize the months leading up to the incident, and not just the evening it occurred. With Nancy Guthrie's case, investigators are still trying to figure out if any monetary issues, legal agreements, or other outside factors could have supplied a motive. Because if Nancy Guthrie was targeted on purpose, the motive might not be found in the events of February 1st. It could be buried somewhere in the months before she vanished. And this is the exact timeline that law enforcement is now carefully examining. One of the most significant challenges that investigators are confronting in this case is not just who is responsible for the crime, but how much information the perpetrator had before the evening Nancy Guthrie went missing. This is because a number of things that took place that evening indicate there was a plan. For instance, the doorbell camera was located and shut down very quickly. The individual neared the house at a time when the majority of residents were not awake, and the sequence of events implies that whoever showed up at the residence did not linger. These points might appear insignificant, but for detectives, they can signal forethought. Experts in criminal profiling frequently refer to this concept as target familiarity, which suggests the offender might have a prior understanding of the victim's surroundings before the offense takes place. They might be aware of where security equipment is installed, they could know which access points are shielded from street view, and they might even have an idea of how long it takes for someone to spot that something is wrong. For senior citizens who reside by themselves, that kind of information can be incredibly hazardous, as it enables a perpetrator to orchestrate the attack for the precise moment the victim is at their most defenseless. Detectives who are looking into Nancy Guthrie's case are attempting to pinpoint how the suspect might have acquired this information. In some instances, that information is gathered from a person who has been in the house before, like a service technician or a delivery person, someone working on maintenance nearby, or even just an individual who has watched the home over a period of time. Forensic specialists who are analyzing the case have noted that the perpetrator's actions on the front porch do not seem to be haphazard, as the individual goes straight for the camera, conceals it, and then takes it down. This series of actions unfolds rapidly, perhaps too rapidly, according to some specialists, for a person who is unfamiliar with the home, which brings up a vital question that detectives are still working to resolve. If the perpetrator was already familiar with Nancy Guthrie's property, when did they acquire that knowledge? The reason this is important is that finding out how the perpetrator got that information might uncover something detectives have not yet found: the exact point in time when the entire scheme was first conceived. Even with weeks of investigative work, the sequence of events connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has many holes, and these missing pieces continue to vex the detectives on the case. The final verified glimpse of Nancy happens as she gets back to her residence just before 10 p.m. The garage door is seen closing. Lights are thought to have been left on in the house, and everything seemed perfectly normal. After that, the residence went silent for almost 4 hours, with nothing of note being registered, no security alarms, no calls for help, and no oddities mentioned by people living nearby. But then, just before 2 in the morning, things started happening in quick succession. The camera at the front door is taken down. Motion detectors register movement. The monitoring signal from Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker loses its connection to her phone. And from that point on, no more signals are received to indicate her location. That series of events establishes a brief period in which the offense probably took place, and detectives theorize the perpetrator may have been at the location for under 30 minutes. In numerous criminal inquiries, that kind of swiftness often points to something crucial: forethought, because culprits who are already familiar with a location tend to move with speed. They show up with a clear idea of their objective, they carry out their plan, and they get away before anyone even knows that there is a problem. The peaceful community where Nancy Guthrie lived might have also aided the perpetrator in getting away without being seen. Since late in the evening, the Catalina Foothills neighborhood grows almost entirely still, with very little car traffic and most of the houses being dark. A car departing from that area in the very early morning hours wouldn't necessarily draw any notice, which is the reason detectives are still poring over surveillance recordings from adjacent roads and the larger vicinity. While some cameras did record cars driving by, none of them have been conclusively connected to the perpetrator so far, and this situation leaves detectives grappling with the very same puzzle they faced when the case first opened. It seems that whoever orchestrated the events of that evening had a solid grasp of the timing, the setting, and the dangers at play. However, detectives are still trying to figure out how they had so much information before the offense was even underway. As law enforcement continues to sift through every single item of evidence related to Nancy Guthrie's vanishing, a particular hypothesis has started to quietly make the rounds among certain forensic professionals. It's not the only hypothesis being considered, but it's a possibility that law enforcement can't afford to overlook. The elder abuse hypothesis. As forensic experts who analyze offenses against senior citizens note that these situations frequently start with a common confusion about what elder abuse truly entails. A lot of individuals associate elder abuse exclusively with physical violence occurring within a residence, but in the context of criminal inquiries, the definition can encompass a much broader scope of behaviors, including financial swindling, psychological manipulation, pressure tactics, and occasionally offenses that originate from financial motivations but spiral into something much more grave. Detectives examining Nancy Guthrie's case are carefully investigating whether there were any indications of weakness or exposure prior to her vanishing, because seniors who reside on their own can occasionally be made into targets without even knowing it. They might be inclined to trust others without question. They may depend on assistance from various people, and they might not always be able to tell when another person is exploiting them. Forensic professionals state that one of the initial aspects detectives look into in situations like these is the victim's everyday life, including who they came into contact with, who was allowed into their residence, who was familiar with their schedule, and who could have known about their financial state. Nancy Guthrie's daily life seemed to follow a set pattern, filled with family get-togethers, doctor's visits, frequent conversations with her friends, and attendance at church. These kinds of routines offer a sense of security for an individual residing by themselves, but they can also lead to a very predictable life. And in the world of criminal investigations, predictability can sometimes make a person a more straightforward target, which isn't to say that detectives are certain elder abuse was a factor. Authorities have not gone on the record to support that particular hypothesis, but forensic professionals maintain that the idea still needs to be explored. Because if Nancy Guthrie was deliberately chosen due to her age, her potential defenselessness, or her access to money, the offense may not have begun on the evening she vanished. It could have started much earlier, with an individual observing her life, monitoring her habits, and noticing something that investigators are still trying to grasp. Just how exposed Nancy Guthrie might have seemed to the individual who ultimately arrived at her home. As the inquiry into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie moves forward, detectives are painstakingly constructing a sequence of events almost completely from technological sources, including doorbell triggers, surveillance footage, pacemaker transmissions, and electronic data that offer tiny glimpses of what transpired in those pre-dawn hours. However, detectives are also casting their net wider than just the evening of the incident, because seasoned investigators understand a critical fact. Offenses that target susceptible individuals seldom happen out of the blue, as they typically unfold over a period of time. Someone keeps watch, someone collects details, someone figures out the daily patterns, and in the end, someone determines that the time is right to make a move. That potential scenario has prompted investigators to go back and review every single contact Nancy Guthrie might have had during the weeks and months leading up to her disappearance. People living nearby, individuals providing services, people who came to visit, and basically anyone who might have been able to get onto her property are being looked at, and detectives are also analyzing trends within the community itself. They are examining surveillance footage from roads in the area, the flow of cars during the late-night period, and any strange occurrences noted by other residents, as every minute fact could possibly hold a clue about how the perpetrator got to the house and how they got away. In a lot of criminal inquiries, cracking the case comes down to finding that one tiny piece of information that doesn't align with the rest of the story. Like a car that showed up at an odd hour, an individual noticed strolling through the vicinity, or a daily habit that was abruptly altered after the incident took place. This is the reason why law enforcement frequently turns to the community for assistance, because a person might recall noticing something that didn't seem important then, but when combined with all the other evidence, that single piece of information could be the key to what really happened. For the time being, detectives are looking into every single angle. This is because somewhere in the sequence of events surrounding Nancy Guthrie's vanishing, detectives are convinced that a crucial piece of the puzzle is still out there, a single fact that might reveal who arrived at her house that evening and what their intentions were. Several weeks after Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her residence in Tucson's Catalina foothills, the single most vital question in this investigation has yet to be answered. Where could she be? Every digital footprint has been traced, every witness has been questioned, and endless surveillance recordings have been meticulously pored over. Authorities have thoroughly inspected all the items that were recovered from the residence. A detailed sequence of events leading up to her vanishing has been pieced together using data from electronic devices at her residence. Despite this, the puzzle of Nancy Guthrie's whereabouts remains completely unsolved, and forensic specialists advise that investigations into the elderly often demand a slow and steady approach. Frequently, the entire solution can be found within one small, disregarded clue. It might be an object that appears insignificant until detectives finally grasp its true relationship to all the other facts. In the meantime, investigators are pursuing every possible avenue they can find. This is because, in a case of this nature, the tiniest piece of information can completely alter the investigation's course. Maybe somebody recalls a specific car that drove through the area that evening. Perhaps a viewer will be able to identify the person who was recorded on the front door camera. It is possible that someone holds a key detail about Nancy Guthrie's daily habits that has eluded the investigation so far. That one piece of knowledge could be the critical element that solves everything. So, if you possess any details concerning the vanishing of Nancy Guthrie, you are urged to call the FBI tip line or the police department in your town. Be sure to subscribe to this channel for the latest news as the inquiry pushes forward to find answers. For as long as the facts remain concealed, a single, haunting question will forever be tied to this investigation. This story reminds us of a painful truth. Danger does not always come from strangers, and vulnerability is not always loud or visible. Sometimes, it lives quietly behind closed doors, in the life of an elderly person who seems safe, loved, and protected. Nancy Guthrie's case is more than a mystery. It is a powerful warning about how easily older adults can become targets when they live alone, depend on medication, or trust the wrong people. The deepest lesson here is that care must never become assumption. Families, neighbors, and communities should not wait for tragedy before paying closer attention. A missed call, a broken routine, or a small sign of fear may be more important than it seems. Elderly people do not only need love in words. They need protection, presence, and people who notice when something is wrong. This case also teaches us that every human life, no matter the age, deserves urgency, dignity, and justice. Older adults should never be treated as invisible or easy to exploit. Their safety must matter just as much as anyone else's. In the end, the most meaningful message is simple. Protect the vulnerable, value the elderly, and never ignore the quiet signs that someone may need help before it is too late.